Bola, everyone, Bola, welcome. I hope everyone's okay. Noia, Yakwe, welcome to our second webinar for the Micronesia Center for Sustainable Transport, our rolling series as we build up to MEPC 82. A price on carbon is coming to shipping. So what do we do with the revenues? Welcome to our Talanoa. Just before we move forward, I'd like to begin some housekeeping rules. First, if all our participants in this webinar, can we put our mic on mute? All the participants will introduce themselves and raise questions in the chat. You can raise questions in the chat, or you can also raise your hand via the emoji icon. Also, panelists will answer the questions from the audience after the discussion on the questions posed by our keynote speaker. The participants, just to let you know that our event, our webinar is currently being recorded. If you don't want yourself to be seen on the recording, you can also cut your video, but this whole webinar is recorded. We have planned this for an hour, but because this is a Pacific webinar, we're on island time, so we're happy to keep the Talanoa going a little bit over time for those with the energy and for the energy to keep the Talanoa going. Before I begin, I wanted to share a song from an original called Hanua Hanuet. It's from the island of Rotuma, where I come from. And this is a song about preserving our indigenous ways of life, the environment that keeps that we depend on. And I hope you guys enjoy it. It's called Hanua Hanuet. Yeah. Hanua Hanuet, te mamfua ne no hoe, rotumaus Hanuet, ang whakanua pumue, reone kia ane, pal eli charavane, fu ewone Pasifika, hie, Hanua Hanuet, te mamfua ne no hoe, rotumaus Hanuet, ang whakanua pumue, reone kia ane, pal eli charavane, fu ewone Pasifika, hie, if we folia titi, wapene isi, makwakanua, ele siriena, haniste is, pamerle pute hoi, hanisina, hoya lelehinga, hoya fokinga, if we folia titi, wapene isi, makwakanua, ele siriena, haniste is, pamerle pute hoi, hanisina, hoya lelehinga, hoya fokinga, hie, ae, Thank you. Oh, by the way, my name is John Tokeve. I'm with MCST, and I'm joining you all from the Pacific at the University of Hawaii. And it's a pleasure to be your moderator for this webinar. So, colleagues, we sit under a fast-ticking clock in the countdown to determine the details of how IMO states will deliver a truly equitable transition for shipping by MEPC 83. The webinars that we're doing are an opportunity for us to explore some of the difficult questions of our delegations. Today, we're going to focus on the money And we have a stellar lineup of panelists on the mic for you all. And I hope they all have brought their mana and their sharing to Talanoa about these discussions. And as I have opened this space for our Talanoa in Pacific fashion with the song, I'm also very honored to introduce the Honourable Ralph Regenvanu to set the scene and challenge our panelists and everyone with some of the provocative questions. Keeping the questions flowing in the chat, and we'll open the debate after the panel have responded to our Honourable Minister. The Honourable Ralph Regenvanu is well recognized at home, across the ocean and the globe for his courageous and outspoken advocacy of climate justice and equitable transition. He is a Ni Vanuatu anthropologist, artist, and politician, and has been a member of parliament since 2008. He is the current Minister for Climate Change Adaptation, Energy, Environment, Meteorology, Geohazards, and Disaster Management. I can only imagine how busy that must keep him. Vanuatu, an already carbon negative country, absorbs more emissions than it produces. It's also rated the country most at risk of natural disasters, according to the UN. In 2015, a super cyclone Pam devastated Vanuatu, and there has been no respite since. So on the minister's watch, Vanuatu has been visited by Kevin, Judy, and Loma in the last year alone. And these are the volcanoes, the rising seas, the droughts, the natural disasters they constantly face. Yet somehow he finds time to stand tall as a climate champion, tirelessly advocating for the current ICJ opinion and Vanuatu's leadership in establishing a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, targeting the source of 86% of CO2 emissions that cause climate change, being fossil fuels. Minister, our small island states are indebted to you for the leadership you are also providing for us at the IMO negotiations, alongside our ministers and ambassadors from across the Pacific, and now the Caribbean and Indian Oceans. Sir, we welcome you to this space, and I invite you to set the scene for our Talanoa today on revenue use for shipping's carbon price. Before you probe our panel of experts with some of the leading questions, I wanted to ask you, when you flew out of Heathrow in MEPC 81, did you feel we were on track for an equitable transition? Did the IMO glass feel half full or half empty? Minister Ralph, I give you the space. Waxia.
Many thanks, John, for those warm words, and greetings to the panel and our audience. And thank you to the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport for providing this space for such a critical debate. And I apologize for not being able to be with you in real time, because at this moment I'm meeting with the New Zealand Climate Minister, who is visiting our country for one day today. Anyway, it feels like it has taken years to get to the point of the conversation where we are finally going to address the vexed issue of what revenues will be raised at IMO and how they'll be used. But in fact, it's only been a decade. But now we have a critically short time frame, less than 12 months, to make the most critical decisions in shipping's history. What price we put on shipping emissions will be the single biggest factor that determines whether the paradigm shift this sector has committed to will meet the very ambitious targets we have also all agreed to. Where we decide to then reinvest these revenues, whether most goes back into the industry as incentives and subsidies and trading schemes, or if the majority is directed to the global south, and in particular SIDS and LDCs, will determine whether this is really going to be an equitable transition or an empty slogan. Your question is a good one. Do I see a glass half full or half empty? I feel like at the beginning of the day, we see the glass at least half full of enormous unrealized potential. And there is reason to celebrate at IMO. Who really believed a decade ago that this sector would be capable of achieving the consensus we did at MEPC 80 to set a target of full decarbonization by 2050, to finally put that price on carbon that we first all agreed was going to be essential back in 2003, and that we would see giant sailing ships again on our oceans. So yes, we've come a long way. But by evening, I can still see a glass that is still half full. of enormous unrealized potential. Because the reality is that we are not making progress at anything like the speed we need to. I'm going to keep it simple here, John. I am here as a politician facing a number of difficult decisions that we all need to make at IMO over the next 12 months. I'm not an engineer or an economist, so I don't need to hear complicated formulas or complex scenario modeling results. It does seem to me, however, that there is a tendency at IMO to dwell on the minutiae of detail when we have not spent sufficient focused time on agreeing what our overall objectives are and what is really meant by those little words: promote, incentivize, contribute, net, compensate. We have some reasonably clear choices to make. What weight to give to subsidizing industry mitigation pathways versus how much and how to invest in an equitable transition in the global south. Do we want a simple and straightforward and relatively easy to administer levy, or some mixture of ever more complex trading schemes? Do we lead with a levy or carrot and follow with a big stick of a fuel standard? Or do we impose a fuel standard now when there is no alternative fuel to buy? Do we choose the measures that will deliver the emission savings in real time? Or do we opt for the lowest cost option? And who manages the money? Is it IMO? Is it a brand new fund manager? Or is it an existing fund manager? If it is IMO, is there any conflict between its role as a global regulator and its role as a development agency? At IMO and in related events, I've heard this transition described as a $1 trillion opportunity for shipping, a once-in-a-generation investment scramble to recapitalize and refuel the global trading fleet. And my mind immediately jumps to our small and battered fleet of tiny and old ships that service the cyclone and storm-lashed islands of Vanuatu, and whether this means we will also get new fleets and new fuels. Ours are not international ships. We can barely keep our little fleets going at current costs. How could we ever afford new ships, let alone new fuels? And the commitment we all made at MEPC 80 to contribute to an equitable transition that leaves no state behind, is that a contribution commensurate with shipping's past and future contribution to the climate crisis? Or commensurate with the shipping capacity to contribute? Or is that like the contribution you leave in the bar at the night when you're leaving the bar? Of course, our scientists will tell you the glass is never empty. It is always full of something. The correct question is, how much of the contents are just hot air? And so that is my first question for the panel. Our small alliance of SIDS has consistently proposed that a majority of the revenues should be diverted to the global south, in particular SIDS and LDCs. It seems there is a lot of consensus at IMO around the need to incentivize the fleet. And while I definitely heard everyone at IMO acknowledge the need for the transition to be equitable for all, I have not heard much detail on what that actually means in practice. So question one, what is the balance that is needed between investing revenues in mitigating the pollution at source and reparation for the damage caused by that pollution? Second question, I hear a lot of talk at MEPC about flexibility mechanisms. I confess to finding all the acronyms and formulas confusing, but am I right that these are simply forms of credit trading schemes and that the revenues are just recycled within the industry? My question is, I understand that an emissions trading scheme is going to make money, but do they lead to a real and equitable reduction? Why do we need this too? And if we do need flex, which flex do we need? Trading schemes, freebates, subsidies, rewards, pooling? Again, as a minister responsible for disaster response in one of the most naturally disaster-prone and poorest countries on earth, and as minister responsible for climate change in one of the most climate-vulnerable nations, I've heard repeatedly at IMO that if there is a negative cost to this transition, then it is also my country that will most likely pay the highest cost by a considerable margin. So I'm in a conundrum. I need shipping to do all that it can, as quickly as it can, if we are to have any chance at responding to the deepening climate crisis. At the same time, we can simply not afford today's transport costs, let alone any additional increase. As John kindly noted, Vanuatu is already carbon negative. We have not contributed to the problem. I understand that IMO and all the other agencies will commit to doing all they can to avoid us being disproportionately impacted. But even so, I predict we will see our small states subject to higher prices. So question 3, should countries like Vanuatu be entitled to direct financial compensation for disproportionate impacts to their economies and communities? I guess I have a final overarching question. The decisions made at MEPC 83 will be a watershed moment. Either we will take a path of highest ambition to achieve a paradigm level shift to a globally equitable decarbonisation transition in less than a generation, or we will take a lower cost and weaker solution. What if we make the wrong decisions at MEPC 83, or worse, we fail to reach decisions at MEPC 83? John, thank you again for the opportunity to be with you for this important discussion, and I look forward to the panelists' responses. I thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Thomas, Minister Ralph. Really, really good questions. So I think just taking note of the questions that were raised. The first one was, what is the balance that is needed between investing revenues in mitigating the pollution at source and reparations for the damage caused by that pollution? The second one he mentioned was, an ETS is going to make money, but do they lead to a real and equitable reduction? Why do we need this tool? And if we need a flex, what kind of flex do we need? Trading schemes, fee-based, subsidies, rewards, pooling. Question 3 was, should countries like Vanuatu be entitled to direct financial compensation for the disproportionate impacts to their economies and communities? And the last one, if I was right, was, what if we make the wrong decisions at MEPC 83, or worse, we fail to reach decisions by then? Those were the main questions that I got out. So again, thank you, Thomas, Minister Ralph, for raising those questions and for your opening keynote. Thank you. Now I wanted to move to our panelists, our esteemed line of panelists. I wanted to acknowledge them and just introduce them for everyone at this webinar. Please welcome Athena Schutz, a dedicated legal researcher affiliated with the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport. With an unwavering commitment to combating climate change and mitigating environmental impacts through legal frameworks and policies, Athena's journey into advocacy began during her tenure as a law student. Since then, she has immersed herself in a multitude of climate and environmental initiatives, seamlessly transitioning between roles in civil society and government projects. A familiar face at the International Maritime Organization meetings, Athena Schutz assumes the role of a negotiator representing the Marshall Islands. Since December 2022, she's been a steadfast presence at crucial committees such as the Marine Environment Protection Committee, the Technical Cooperation Committee, and the Legal Committee. With a passion for effecting change through law and policy, Athena Schutz stands as a beacon of hope in the quest for a sustainable future. Our next panelist, Mr. Simon Chin Yi. Simon has over 15 years of experience in international cooperation and policy through multiple research roles within academia, as well as his work at the UN Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. He joined UCL's School of Public Policy in 2019 as a lecturer in global environmental politics, international public policy, and development studies. Simon's research is focused on climate change, conflict, and vulnerable populations. His research links climate change to concepts of security within vulnerable populations by looking at diverse national and local experiences threatened by climate change. Additionally, his research examines the climate change negotiations, the global climate negotiations, understanding how norms, values, and rules constructed within the global climate regime have an influence on national policies. Simon's current research project looks at the decarbonization of the maritime sector in Eastern and Southern Africa to support countries as they consider how to achieve GHG emission reductions, including the co-development of concrete and realistic plans both for the national and international decarbonization actions political buy-in for implementation of these actions, as well as capacity development within the country. Our third panelist is Mr. John Kautoke. He's an advisor of maritime GHG matters, working out of the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport. He began working on IMO GHG matters while he was working at the High Commission of the Kingdom of Tonga in London, and has assisted Tonga in its negotiations since MEPC 79. He has also served as a member of the steering committee on the comprehensive impact assessment of midterm measures. He holds an LLM in international law and an LLB in law. John wants to see a future where prosperity and progress advance alongside consideration for those that live on the forefront of the climate crisis and their survival. Our final panelist, colleagues, is Miss Darlene Gaitan. She is the Ports Commissioner for the Belize Port Authority. The Ports Commissioner is the CEO of the Port Authority and is responsible for regulating ports, shipping, and auxiliary maritime services. With 15 years of experience at the Belize Port Authority, she started as a vessel traffic services officer, then moved to Port State Control, where she could eventually head the technical department. Ms. Gaitan is a career officer who was promoted to CEO in 2023 last year, and is only the second woman to hold the post. Ports Commissioner Gaitan has a master's degree in maritime management from Memorial University of Newfoundland, and has trained extensively in maritime affairs, port management, and project management. Colleagues, our panelists. Now over to you, panelists, with the first question. What is the balance that is needed between investing revenues in mitigating the pollution at source and reparation for the damage caused by that pollution? Panelists, I give you the space. Oexia. Maybe Atina?
Many thanks. Many thanks, John. Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot. I was gonna attempt to break the ice for us, but yeah, the minister posed some very pertinent questions, especially as we move on to another phase of the negotiations where we're really going to narrow down on the types of measures that are going to be implemented, and as well as how we spend the revenues of such any of these economic measures. So the question the minister posed was, what is the balance needed between investing revenues in mitigating pollution and reparation for the damage caused by that pollution? Well, my response to that would be, well, we need both of them, like absolutely. Under environmental law, there's an important principle called the principle of polluter pays, which places an obligation on the polluter to bear the costs of managing its pollution to prevent damage to the human health or the environment. So shipping, as we all know, or those who are not familiar with the shipping world, it's known that it's responsible for almost 3% of global emissions. And that's going to continue to rise if we continue with business as usual. So this makes shipping, essentially a polluter. So when shipping doesn't cover those costs of, remediating the impacts to the environment, the impacts then become externalized. So it's then borne by the costs of these impacts are then borne by society and future generations. When it comes to shipping decarbonization, using revenues to mitigating emissions and to compensate for the damages caused by that pollution are parts and parcel of the job that we have to do when it comes to the upcoming meetings. It is the shipping industry's responsibility to provide reparations and compensation for the environmental damages and pollutions that it has caused, both past, present, and future. Furthermore, this also closely relates to a just and equitable transition, which is one of the requirements that we agreed to under the IMO GHG strategy. And it's one where we have to leave no country behind. So if you're stuck having to fight off the impacts of climate change in your own country, this doesn't leave us much room to fulfill our targets under the IMO GHG strategy. So these two mitigating pollution at the source and reparation for damage caused by pollution, they have to go together. We need them both absolutely. That's me, and I'll hand it over to my fellow panelists.
Thanks,
Thank
Atina.
you.
If I potentially could go next and run off what Atina said, that's great. That's so comprehensive. I, like any good academic, will bring more questions to this discussion than answer them, unfortunately. But I think one of the ones that I think went up to direct to the question is that small island states, LDCs, countries, but specifically small island states and LDCs, they need to have control of this balance. They need control of what is happening with the revenues that are coming in. They understand what is best for their industry. They understand what is best for their communities. So if I could break it down in three different ways. First, it's to understand where these revenues and investments, what should they be part of? There's of the fleets, for example, the cruise ships, the cargo ships, the fishing vessels, whatever it may be, the control that the LDCs and SIDS have, it's important because they know who owns the ships. They know what is being transported. Shipping, as Atina just said, is so critical for global supply chains. So now those supply chains are changing, and in a positive way, because many supply chains are looking to cut emissions. But where does that leave small island states, right? We need to figure out where those cruise ships, for example, fit in the tourism sector. What capacity do countries have to update their fleets? I think the minister said this, right? What technologies, where did they come from? And if we're going to create hubs of green energy, can they be in the region? Can we increase energy production in the region? Right, so I told you I didn't bring more questions than answers in this one. The second, though, again, it's about looking at the infrastructure itself. The damage to infrastructure, it goes beyond shipping. It is beyond it, but it's affected by it, right? So again, the countries know what they need: damage to ports, damage to roads, damage to building. If I could just bring up a few examples of research I did about 2016, 17, 18 in my postdoc, for example, it was looking at these vulnerable populations. Dominica, Hurricane Maria devastated, destroyed 95% of their infrastructure, some of it permanently. This is a country that has a great burgeoning tourism industry. Now, when we think of that 95%, we think 95% of the infrastructure is damaged. It's not damaged for 1 year and the tourists come back next year. It takes over a decade to do that. Tonga, I was working with Sione Fulivai, who potentially some of you know, that works in the climate space. There you go. He was explaining to me a lot about how Cyclone Kita devastated their economy and their country, but they were already recovering 4 years after Hurricane Ian, or Cyclone, sorry, Ian in this case. So these repeated weather events are compounding the problems that they're having. Mozambique in 2019 with Idai, for example, like Hurricane Idai, well, thousands of people died, just over 1,000 people died. Infrastructure was damaged. The town of Beira, the city of Beira was destroyed. So all of these different infrastructure problems, they need to figure out where the money can be spent. This balance that we're talking about needs to be spent on these different aspects. And the third thing I'll just say very quickly is this idea of resilience. So we're really, really good as human beings at reacting to well, maybe we're not really that good at it actually, but we react to these storms, these hurricanes, these cyclones, these earthquakes, whatever. We react to it. We need to be resilient, but that costs money, as does mitigation. All of these factors cost money. So if we go back to it, I would say that if we look at the balance, we need to understand the country-driven goals. They understand the needs and the capacity that they have. They also understand the demand of the technology, for example, for both mitigation and resilience measures. And finally, and potentially as someone who's worked and done research on the Green Climate Fund, on Adaptation Fund, and now I'm doing it on Loss and Damage Fund, the access to this finance is very, very off-putting for many countries, and it's a roadblock. So we need to figure out how to gain access to that finance. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Simon and Atina, for sharing that. And I think that connects to I think to the second question, when we look at, understanding this this ETS, if it's going to, because it is going to make money to, to help with the management of all the climate disasters that are happening. So with this ETS, we know it's going to make money, but do they lead to like a real and equitable reduction? And what and with this flex, what kind of flex do we need? Like trading schemes, fee baits, subsidies? I think, Simon, would you like to share a bit on that?
Thank you, John. And I was going to say, you can always please shut me up when I'm talking too much, right?
No.
So I'll lead on this, and then perhaps I'll let, if he wants to, John can talk about, for example, the 6-pack plus mechanism.
Sure.
So, when we're looking at this flex, first of all, we don't know what's going to happen, right? This is the thing. Everything's on the table. Too many things are potentially on the table. Isn't it great that things are off the table, but we need to figure out what those are. So if we can break it down to understanding, for example, what the potential and what is on the table of happening. First, it's this global fuel standard, right? So it's what we have. We have a simple, flexible global fuel standard, and a simple global fuel standard and a flexible global fuel standard. So in terms of the economic element, this is understanding what it means through subsidies and rewards. So any sort of flex mechanism, this is the fuel standard combined with these emissions trading schemes we're talking about, meaning that ships that over comply can sell those ships, sell them to other ships that, for example, are underperforming. Does this sound familiar? This is carbon trading. Here we go again. What it should be doing is that the market allows for corporations, for investors to trade carbon credits. And this should be mitigating the climate crisis as we have it, while at the same time creating new markets. Yay, that should be what's happening. That should be the thing that we're working at, right? So why hasn't it worked? And so that's my big question with all of these flexibility mechanisms, is that we have had trading schemes of sorts since Kyoto. So the problem, a lot of it is with weak regulation and weak implementation of these schemes. So who's monitoring this? Like, obviously there are monitoring systems in place, and there are, I don't know how many trading schemes are out there now. Many trading schemes are out there at the moment. So who's monitoring them? And then what are the consequences for non-compliance? Or even worse, if it's fraud, right? So for example, in some of the work I did a few years ago, it was looking at just carbon trading and climate. So most of my work is in that larger global, wider climate space. And there's a sub-national trading scheme between the province of Quebec, where I'm from, and California. And so then it was understood that it was overcomplicated, and the two entities were double counting. So they were double counting their carbon credits, so that they were both claiming credit for the same credits. And so things like that can happen. So if we can look at the other ones very, very quickly. So we look at pooling. That is a private emissions trading scheme where ships can trade credits with other fleets. And again, the question is then, okay, who is monitoring this? Of course, there are things that are monitoring this, but again, it's about compliance and consequences. This fee bait that we're talking about now as well, that is a subsidy paid if a ship or a fleet over complies. So in essence, we would see that this isn't such a bad idea, for example, because it is promoting stronger or better action on reducing emissions. So there's that. And then there's, of course, the levy, which perhaps I will let John take over and talk about, because this is where the contribution, if you will, or pollution charge on all greenhouse gas emitted by well-to-wake operators. So I could go on, but I potentially talk too much. Potentially I'll pass that on to John if you don't want to put you on the spot.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think he was talking about me, this John, not you, John. There's too many Johns in this.
I'm the bridge connecting to you, Toko. Over to you, Toko. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, John. And thanks, Simon. Yeah, I think it was quite comprehensive. Yeah, as you mentioned, I think the main problem with a lot of these flexibility mechanisms, or all of them, is that I think at this point it's too complicated to implement something on the GFS. As you know, the six-pack position has been that GFS has to be simplified, and we want to base this on something like the sulfur fuel oil regulation, a simplified system like that. And because of the fact that it raises revenues, I think that causes some problems as well. Because we have to ask as to what's the purpose of those revenues and where are they going? I mean, if you're going to have a levy in addition to a GFS and a flexibility mechanism, what is the purpose of raising revenues in the GFS? And I think we saw one group of countries propose the fact that these revenues would go towards jump-starting the transition by funding small-scale projects, which will then be scalable into the global scale. But then why would you have that when the levy comes into force? It will do the exact same thing. So, you know, you're duplicating efforts, and I don't think it's helpful to have this situation at this standard. Also, the whole point about equity here. If revenues are raised within the ETS, the revenues will only flow within the sector. Whereas if we're looking at the levy and the distribution that the six-pack has been talking about and it being equitable, this has to go to states. It cannot flow within the sector, just between ships like the trading does. You know, they can just use that to for their own purposes. But yeah, we really need the revenues to be able to go to states and not just flow within the sector. Yeah, that's all I had to say. I think it was very comprehensive what you said, Simon.
Just to finish there, like, great, I like what you said, but just one sentence literally is the world is trying to solve the climate crisis through carbon credits. Has it worked? So why are we introducing flexibility mechanisms that could potentially get people out of solving the problem? That's my last word on that.
Thank you. Thanks, Toko. Thanks, Simon. I think it'll come to, you know, it's all the questions are connected, which I wanted to ask our wonderful ladies if they had anything to share on this question too, or the third one that's connected, like should countries like Vanuatu be entitled to the compensation for their disproportionate impact? Darlene?
Hi, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Yes, I think we've heard these conversations at other progressive forums, for instance, at the UNFCCC. So it very likely is going to trickle to shipping that indeed climate vulnerable states such as Vanuatu, such as Belize, when it comes to disproportionate impacts, you know, when the regulations come into effect, we will still be even more so impacted. So I believe it may be, perhaps the word is not re-victimized that we want to use, because we already are paying a lot for climate change, and also we are going to bear the cost of progressive climate action or high ambition that our states vie for. So indeed, we believe that these should also have direct compensation, or if, I don't know if the word is reparations for also these impacts as well. So that would be my take on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Darlene. Sister, yeah.
Sure. Thank you. If I could also add on to Darlene's contribution, Minister's question on whether it should be entitled to direct compensation is also very, very important. And my response to that would be, well, because shipping, as I mentioned before, it's an industry that has polluted, but because it hasn't really done much to manage its own pollution, much of its impacts have been externalized. So shipping is an industry that has not paid its negative externalities. It's highly polluting, and it also contributes to the climate change impacts that we are seeing. It is also one that, due to not being due to not internalizing the costs of its pollution, it's one that has largely walked away. Actually, it's entirely walked away scot-free from the damages caused by its greenhouse gas emissions. Another reason why Vanuatu, so that itself should make it very clear that in Vanuatu, as well as other countries who are disproportionately negatively impacted by climate change, are also entitled to that. Another reason is that equity demands it. Vanuatu's contribution to climate change, along with the rest of the Pacific region, its contribution is negligible. So not only are countries battling climate change, so this does things like mitigation, adapting to the climate change impacts we're seeing, but then also contending with impacts caused by loss and damage. These are all very expensive. You then are also faced with the additional obligation of reducing greenhouse gas emissions under the IMO regulations, which were going to be coming into force in a few years' time. And that also requires significant amounts of investment and technological changes, which our countries really do not have. At the same time, there's not much support available for us to be at the scale that we need to be in when it comes to decarbonization of our fleets. An example that comes to mind is the Marshall Islands' new ship that's just been built in South Korea, the Juranag, which is on its way over to Majuro. It took the government almost 10 years to secure just one. But in reality, we need at least a dozen more of these for the region. And that's hardly an equitable transition as it is, especially when you hear of big shipping companies and the global north countries ordering ships with zero emission fuels. And there's also a question of how does that actually play out and how effective are those new fuels are. Also, it's we've said this before, but it's also addressing another issue, which is the global inequality caused by international trade. So yeah, these are various reasons why countries like Vanuatu should definitely be entitled to financial compensation for the disproportionate negative impacts. It's also I think it's also understood generally that any changes or any charges to emissions is going to cause an increase in pricing goods. And considering that we are all at the very end of international trade routes, we will also be very disproportionately negatively impacted by those, in addition to the above reasons that I've mentioned already. That's for me. If other fellow panelists want to add on, please do. Thanks.
Yeah, but I'll just come in briefly. Yeah, I think this whole discussion around this issue being discussed in different forms, I think we should be very careful and remember that shipping was left out of the Paris Agreement. Because I know, as Darlene did say, this is being discussed in other forums, and the issue of climate finance and loss of damage is also in that space. But I think we should try to keep these discussions separate, especially with the way that we're going to deal with the revenues. Because that discussion on climate financing and loss and damage is ongoing at the UNFCCC process, and this process which we're doing here now is separate. So we need to keep those two narratives separate. The truth is that what we're discussing at IMO is advancing far ahead of what the UNFCCC is doing. Yeah, I just wanted to put that out there, especially as proponents of a levy and equitable distribution, that we need to keep those two narratives separate.
Malo toko. That's interesting. Oh, Simon, you wanted to raise?
Just one word. I mean,
Absolutely.
What John said, what everyone is saying is so important. It's really but actually where it's money spent because I go to the UNFCCC negotiations, this talk of this, whatever this just financial thing will be, is talked about as in, oh, it could contribute to the L&D fund if there's more. And that scares me a lot, because then all of a sudden everything gets conflated. But actually, that's not what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say was that it's just because words matter so much. You all know this. You're all the negotiators, right? I'm not. But understanding this idea of this as a compensation, it's an equitable revenue distribution mechanism, right? It's like this word that is compensation. I get why it's used. I get, but it's, to me, it's what Atina said about the Marshall Islands. They're at the end of the trading route. So if we're all going to be decarbonizing together, which is what we're supposed to be doing, then we need to understand how revenue is distributed. It's not compensating something from something else. It's because this is it's money paid for, or revenue distributed for action taken. Let's put that.
Thanks, Simon, for that. JK, you spoke about one of the questions too was on this levy. So, what are some of the the economic implications of a levy towards SIDS and LDCs? If any one of you could just share about that on the levy, especially the levy.
So we have this whole process going on within the IMO. We're still trying to assess it through the comprehensive impact assessment of the disproportionate negative impacts, but also what the mechanisms and the distributions would do towards offsetting those D&I, and also addressing other vulnerabilities such as climate vulnerability. But yes, in terms of a levy, we're already starting to see that the magnitude of revenues raised by the levy would be able to offset more costs than those mechanisms that raise less revenue. I think that's quite obvious without having to have an economics background. But I think the analysis is starting to come towards that, but it's not fully ready yet, and I think the steering committee will finish its work, and the report will be ready from the CIA by August, I think, an interim report. But yes, you could already see that with a levy and the revenues distributed towards delivering on what a just and equitable transition would imply, which involves helping us with a regional transition. As you know, in the Pacific, we have very poor line of connection. And when this transition begins, the first thing that we will see happen is that a lot of these big shipping companies will start dumping their non-compliant vessels onto the market. And unfortunately for us in our region, we have to, those are the only vessels we can afford, the non-compliant ones. And so some of those revenues have to go towards assisting with regional shipping and having those vessels which are compliant, and to assist us with our transition as well. I'm sure that I'm missing a lot more, but I'll leave some space for others to come in.
Yeah, thanks, JK. Like Ambassador Ishod had raised, even without a levy, we will continue to pay for the costs of the climate emergency that we have almost nothing to do with. So that, I think that's important. And I think that's also great to be connected to our final question, with the time frame that we have for MEPC 82 and MEPC 83, what happens if we make the wrong decisions, or even we make the wrong decisions? I wanted to ask our sister Dalian if you could share your thoughts on that question.
So that's a very charged question. What if scenarios? And I don't think we can afford to get it wrong at IMO. I mean, we depend heavily on this forum to ensure that we are going to meet just an equitable transition. So to get it wrong means that just an equitable transition stands at a balance. You know, it hangs in a balance for all of our states to be able to effectively transition as we were all meant to take part of this process. So, I mean, it's a huge decision for the various states that are going to be at the upcoming MAPCs, but from our end, it will have to be that the decision aligns with the strategy and that we continue to push for just an equitable transition for all of us, not just for some states or just for the industry or a specific region. So we have to collectively, as we did at the MAPC 80, try to find that balance in between. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. Athena, what do you?
Yeah, thanks, JK. So to add on to, before I address the final question, I just want to add on to the previous question. So JK, John, the panelist, mentioned that the comprehensive impact assessment is ongoing, and it's this process that's looking at, you know, the overall impacts of any certain measures on different types of how would I describe the word, sectors, so fleet, states, and so on. So that's something that we is still ongoing, but we like, as other panelists have mentioned, you know, we are at the very end of the maritime trade routes. So any measure that gets implemented is going to really disproportionately negatively impact us. At the same time, and again, going back to what I said in previous intervention, previous question, we have to take these into account while also aiming to fight off the other climate change impacts we're seeing. So things like, you know, mitigating our overall national emissions while also adapting to climate change impacts nationally. This on top of the added obligation of trying to decarbonize our shipping fleets would be very way beyond our means. And you know, this is essentially, this is why we need revenues to be distributed equitably. And this saying that, this also kind of ties into my response to the final question, which is, you know, what happens if you make the wrong decisions, or worse, we fail to reach decisions at MPC 83? Well, if we come up with no decision, not only will we have just delayed ourselves considerably in implementing, you know, a real global solution, we're also likely going to see an increase in a patchwork of regional or even national initiatives to put some kind of pricing on shipping emissions. While these look good, the issue is these little initiatives, they become, how do I say it, something that's controlled by the instituting government or instituting regional bloc. And this then puts, you know, how we fight for a just and equitable transition, that kind of puts that just and equitable transition on a thread, or if not, you know, that actually just possibly potentially throws it away. Because, and going back to what Simon mentioned, it's really important for small island developing states, least developed countries, and developing countries generally to really define what just and equitable is. And you know, when you put in these regional initiatives and having these under the you know, the control of that instituting government, this kind of, you know, takes away our ability to also really put in solutions to the needs that we need to see on the ground, and that also doesn't really contribute to a just and equitable transition. And it also puts decisions on how to spend spend these revenues to a very small group of countries, which again is not really a just and equitable transition for all of us. So yeah, that would be my response. It's really important that we get this right, because we simply cannot afford any more delays or any more inequitable solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Athena. And I think coming to you, Simon, I could tell you wanted to share that last one. Like, is a wrong decision worse than no decision at all? What do you think, bro?
I mean, we've been here before. We've been here so many times. And I mean, I was finishing my PhD, we're in the middle of my PhD, I can't remember, in lead up to the Paris Agreement. And that was the question in the room. Like I was following the Africa group. I was working with them. They're amazing to see how that they worked, function, to see what a Paris Agreement could work for this group of negotiators. And that question was asked in Bonn 6 months before the Paris Agreement. Is a bad agreement worse than no agreement at all? What are our red lines? Do we have red lines? Like, this was a genuine question that had to be posed in closed doors rooms. So I'm just sharing it here to understand what we need to stick to those red lines. We need to have red lines, and they need to be stick to, because as Athena and everyone just said, like this, we don't have time for this anymore. Like, we are beyond time now. Like, we keep doing this. And I would say, on a positive note, when it comes to shipping, there's a real opportunity that John Kay said here, that they're ahead, or could be. It's so they've been so, as Athena said, they've been so forgotten or gone under the radar for so many years on purpose. Is that this is a chance, though, that to move ahead, because there are real advances and technologies to solve the problem here. First of all. The second of all, I think the thing we see when we're in those rooms is much like we see in climate change. But again, because I work on kind of both spaces, and I'm relatively new to the climate spaces that, relatively new to the shipping spaces, but the political will needs to be there. And in terms of the small island states, for example, the LDCs in general, their voices need to be amplified. I did a paper a few years back on representation, and it's so important in the room to have representation so that the voices are heard. Because I think something that the small island states, Pacific island states specifically, do extremely well in the climate negotiations is identify themselves. They are so good at getting that message across. And I think it's because it's undeniable now. There is the Africa group, I think, is really good with bringing in that moral legitimacy within the room, going, no matter what you're saying, that you're saying you're not going to do the whatever, cut back emissions because it's not time yet, that there is a moral legitimacy there. And I think the SIDS bring in a conscience into the room, and in reminding all of those players that what needs to be done and needs to be done now. And I think that argument is unavoidable, to be honest. I would just say one last thing when it comes to this particular mechanism that I get flagged at when it comes to all these other mechanisms, or these financial mechanisms, is that we want an equitable transition. But we also need equitable distribution of funds, right? All of these, just because a piece of the pie goes to the Pacific doesn't mean it gets equally distributed to the Pacific states, each Pacific state individually. And we've seen this already. Just to give an example, I was with the minister from Chad, for example, and he said, it's great to work with the Africa group, but you know that we get the computers from the 1980s. That's what, like, that's literally what we get. And we don't want those computers. We want the good stuff, right? And so just understanding that equitable transition also should mean an equitable distribution.
Thanks, Simon. Toko, you wanted to say something? We also have some questions in the chat that I'll raise.
Yeah, I can go ahead if there's time, but
yeah, sure, absolutely, bro.
Okay.
Yeah, we're on island time.
Okay, good. So for me, there's like several situations which I see. First, if there's an absence of consensus on the measures, then individual countries or regions will implement their own regulations for ships entering their waters, which will lead to a fragmented regulatory environment. And this could increase operational complexities and costs for the shipping industry. The other thing I see is uncertainty. And so the shipping industry will face increased uncertainty, especially if what is agreed doesn't provide certainty of revenues. So shipping companies may be hesitant to invest in new technologies or operational changes, for example. And also, this doesn't really bode well for the International Maritime Organization's reputation, right? So if the IMO and its member states agree to do something, it doesn't look good if they didn't end up doing it. But the worst of all is that if we don't get the correct measures and we don't agree anything, countries, particularly SIDS and other climate vulnerable countries, would continue to face the brunt of climate change without adequate support or mitigation efforts from the international shipping sector, which will potentially lead to more severe economic and environmental impact. I mean, after all, let's not forget, at the end of the day, that the IMO has contributed to just and equitable transition, and this means that international shipping must pay proportionate to its contribution to climate change. Thanks, that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you, Toko. I see on the chat too, we have some really good questions. I will spend time on answering one of them, which was raised by Amelia Mbola. Amelia, thank you for your question. Kyla, thank you too for your question. The one Amelia raised was, what is the process, recommendations, suggested ways of disbursement if the event flexibility mechanism is agreed upon? And she connected it to the second one. At the IMO, a message seems to be coming through on the MARPOL Annex 6 agreement. Most countries in the region have not ratified MARPOL. So sulfur fuel regulations, can this also be our starting point to show the region's further commitment? I put it to our panelists, Athena, Darlene, or Simon.
Sure, I can tackle the first question, which is what is the process recommendation? So I think JK might have mentioned this already, but that's still an ongoing decision that states have yet to agree on. But he was right in pointing out the current lack of consensus. So that's something that is still on the table. One of the things that the Pacific Bloc has consistently advocated for is for a large portion of at least 51% to go into out of sector, and the remaining would go into investments within the sector. So yeah, we're still fighting for those positions, but we also have recommendations from other proponents of different measures to have nothing go out of sector, everything has to stay within the maritime industry. And then you also have people who are saying like a smaller portion than what we're asking for should go into out of sector. So yeah, these are I think at this point positions that we've reiterated many times, not just within the IMO but also publicly. The question, second question is, who will determine the conclusion of a just and equitable transition? Yeah, I'm looking at the second question put down by John. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I noticed there's multiple. So will it be determined by SIDS and LDCs? Ideally, yes, it should be determined by us. Furthermore, once the JET is accomplished, what are the next steps to ensure that these vulnerable countries don't get left behind once the just and equitable transition has been achieved? Well, to put it shortly, if the just and equitable transition has been achieved, then there are no countries left behind, and our fleets are all fully decarbonized, and we have a robust measure implemented at the IMO. And yes, ideally we have a measure that's been implemented that takes into account all the other vulnerabilities that we have within the shipping sector, but to an extent also out of the sector. We also it's also, and as we've mentioned already, it's really important that it's us who determines, have we really truly been, have we transitioned equitably once we get to that point. And yeah, so yeah, the first and second question answered. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Athena. Darlene, do you have any final thoughts on this?
Yes, so there was a question on the accession or ratification of MARPOL Annex 6, and it speaks to the region, but I imagine the specific region, but we have a similar look at our ratification of MARPOL Annex 6 in the Caribbean region as well. So all of these decisions to regulate shipping, if you're not a party to the convention, you cannot implement. You cannot implement the biofuel standards, the CII, EEXI, none of these things you can implement. So that would be your first step indeed to ratify the instrument. And even when you are taking part of the IMO negotiations, it's important for you to be a contracting party. And secondly, in terms of the implementation shoreside for port state control, without being a party to that MARPOL Annex 6, you cannot implement. So any foreign ships that are calling to port, unless you have within your domestic regulations things like the sulfur cap within your regulations, it's unlikely that you can implement. You will not be able to implement it. That's why you have port state control that speaks of no more favorable treatment. So you have to be a contracting party for you to implement under port state control under no more favorable treatment. So that's one, the signing, and two is the legislation that has to be accompanied to MARPOL Annex 6 to give it full teeth. For instance, if you look at the other regions that have, let's say, the EU, they have very strong regulations that speak of the sulfur cap, speak of real disincentives for shipping not to, pollute their waters. So it cannot just be that we're based on port state control and then there is no fines, penalties to shipping. So you have to domesticate, and that's another gap for us in the region that we're trying to address as well. And of course, there's also the capacity in terms of port state control enforcement, ensuring that we have, for instance, labs or access to labs that are going to test the fuel, for instance, looking at those bunker delivery notes, all of these things. So it's a very good question, because you cannot be behind on the conversation of actual implementation. If you're going to be change agents, you have to ensure that throughout the whole process, you are engaged and you're empowered to be able to implement the regulations. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Darlene. Toko, and then I'll pass it to Simon as our final one.
Okay, let me just find my way to the first question. The first question is process recommendations and invoice disbursement. Okay, I think this from the outset it's very difficult to do that because there's no certainty of revenues from the flexibility mechanism. So I think at this point we cannot, as a proponent of non-flexibility mechanism, we cannot have recommendations, suggestions on something that doesn't have certainty of revenues. That can be very difficult. Who will determine the conclusion of just and equitable transition? Yeah, I think that's a good question, especially since in the strategy, a just and equitable transition hasn't been defined. But I think we've heard from colleagues at the IMO that the Pacific is the main proponents, or SIDS is the main proponents of a just and equitable transition, should be the ones to define it. And so I hope that this will be the consensus that SIDS and LDCs are the ones to define a just and equitable transition. Furthermore, once just accomplished, what are the next steps to ensure? Okay, I think Athena answered the question well enough. In terms of the MARPOL Annex 6 amendments, we as Darlene said, yes, this is the first step, and yeah, this has to come together as a package. Otherwise, we're going to step over what we actually have to do first. So yeah, I think personally that would be, and hopefully we can get that sorted out as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Toko. Simon, you your final thoughts and if it connects to our final question from Andrew Friedman. Thank you for that question. The views on what needs to change, additional information or pressures in the IMO to ensure that we reach a good outcome on revenue disbursement. How can friends best support? Over to you, Simon, and then we will wrap up.
Oh, if only I had the answer to that question. Right? We'd all be in such a better place if I could see, oh, here's a little magic box that I could unwrap, if you will. No, but yeah, I guess what needs to happen is, I think the first thing is that we need to stick to our guns, if you will, and we ensure that not just that voices are heard, but that those red lines I talked about earlier are drawn down. And I think in order to do that, first it's to remind everyone, the room, what needs to be done, just in terms of both reducing emissions in the sector, but also to address climate change, right? Like the big question always is, we have all these mechanisms and these strategies, and who do they work for? And they need to work, and everyone takes them in, like they need to work for their country. I get that, that's true. But it also needs to work for the climate. And that is not the case much of the time, right? This is why we're still talking about this 34 years later. And so we need to remind the room of those outcomes in terms of a just and equitable transition and what it may potentially look like. I'm currently working on a paper looking at sectoral approaches. I'm working on the shipping sector part of it to understand what it could potentially mean, because just and equitable transition has now been taken out of just the shipping space, and it's now talked about in the climate space. So it's trying to understand exactly what we mean by this. And I think one of the things we can think about is to bring it back to that idea of workers' rights, and then build from that to understand what then this can potentially mean. Because as it stands, it's this abstract notion that we should all be equal. And I think we can all agree that's a good idea, but how this works remains to be seen. And I'm afraid I do not have that golden answer for you here, right at this moment in time. Hopefully soon.
Thanks, Simon. We have just one more question that just came in the nick of time before we wrap up. Thank you, Kerlin, for your question. If the regulations go to a vote, do we need to have it ratified? I have ratified MAPOL Annex 6. Darlene, Toko, Atina?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not an expert on IMO process, so I probably won't be able to answer this question. But I think if they're a member of, actually, I won't answer the question because I don't want to be misleading.
Thank you. No, all good, all good, all good, all good. I think we'll reach out to our team, and Kerlin, thank you for that question. We'll get to you on that. But just due to the time restraints, I wanted to thank everyone, all of the participants here, for your questions, for your talanoa. I also wanted to thank our esteemed panelists, Darlene, John, Atina, Simon. Thank you so much for your time in coming and sharing talanoa space with us. I also wanted to thank Honourable Minister Ralph Regenvanu for your opening speech. Thank you for, lighting the spark for these conversations. And I think these conversations need to be spoken of. Just in terms of the build-up, we also have an upcoming webinar that will be held next month. If I could ask our friend Billy, yes, thank you. We'll be, feel free to please save the date. Also these flyers will be sent out to everyone. We will be having it on the 19th of June, 9 a.m. Fiji RMI time, GMT hours. Save the date. We also have our speakers lined up. We have Captain Michael Vass, Eldine Glass, Christian Debukalai, and Maria Sahib, who will be sharing. So yeah, put it in your calendars. And again, I thank you all. I just wanted to ask if our MCST team can please stay back after this webinar. But again, thank you all for your time. Thank you all for your participation in this webinar. And now I end. Thank you again. Inaka. Hoyexia. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Darlene. Thanks, Atina. Thanks, John.
Hola.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Benno.
Thanks,
Bye.
John.
Thanks, everyone.